Mark Rogers TV, Ohio State edition with Brandon Zimmerman from the Buckeye Battle Cry, breaking down, of course, it's just one of four teams left in the nation when we talk playing for a national championship, Ohio State and Clemson, the marquee matchup that will be the second of the semifinal games on New Year's Eve there at the Fiesta Bowl. Brandon, we saw this matchup just 3 years ago, 2013, after losing the Big Ten championship, going to the Orange Bowl, taking on Taj Boyd and Sammy Watkins at the time. Very entertaining game, not an outcome that the Buckeyes really relished. There were a number of defensive issues in that game, facing a ton of speed, but also at that point, if I remember right, either Noah Spence or Adolphus Washington was suspended. Obi missed the game. There was another defensive back. I know either C.J. Barnett or Christian Bryant was injured early in the season, and then the other one was suspended or hurt for that game. There were a number of issues on defense from a personnel standpoint that really hampered the defensive side. But aside from a Philly Brown fumbled punt return sometime in the fourth quarter with a 9-point lead, might have went the Buckeyes' way. But what do you remember from that game?
Well, I remember Sammy Watkins kind of having his way with the Buckeye defense. I think this year you see a different kind of defense from the Buckeyes. When they faced off last time, the Buckeyes had a less aggressive defensive backfield. They kind of played 10 yards off the wide receivers, which led to, Sammy Watkins just getting, passes within the 5-yard range where he was just able to make plays. And Sammy Watkins was a heck of a athlete. So, playing 10 yards off and giving Sammy Watkins that much room to make plays was kind of the ultimate, fail for the Buckeyes during that game. Because I want to say he had over, 230 something yards receiving that day. And to, as you mentioned, there was, I think, 3 of their 4 starting DBs from the beginning of the year were not playing that game. Von Bell made his first start that game and actually kind of came on to the scene and kind of made himself known, starting over, I think it was Pitt Brown, was where Von Bell kind of got his way in there. So it's a different style defense. It's a much quicker defense with Raekwon McMillan and Jerome Baker and those guys playing there at linebacker, Lattimore, Conley on the outside. So I think with the style of offense that Clemson runs, the Buckeyes match up a lot better than they did a few years ago. It's still going to come down to, just keep on working over things over the next month and preparing for Clemson. And, it was a fun game last time, and this time should be no different.
Yeah, the stakes a bit higher, trying to get to a national championship game against the winner of Alabama-Washington. So we talk about the Buckeyes on defense, and I think that's a great call that you make because they were elite along the defensive front and in the backfield, but really banged up, as I mentioned, in some suspensions going back 3 years ago. But at linebacker, not nearly the athletes that they have across the board. Ryan Shazier, of course, special, but besides that, across the board this time around. But they face a Clemson offense that has to be the most dynamic offense that they're going to see this year. Of course, we know about Deshaun Watson, what he can do. He did throw it up for grabs and got picked off 14 times, and maybe that plays into the Buckeyes' strength defensively with all those ball hawks back there. Wayne Gallman's going to be a key. He had kind of a marginal season compared to his breakout of 1,500 yards last year, but he tore it up down the stretch with a couple 100-plus yards against his last few opponents going into the ACC championship game. And then you talk about a deep wide receiver core, like top-end guys with Artavis Scott and Mike Williams, but Hunter Renfrow and Deion Kane, they just bring like 5 or 6 guys that have NFL-type ability like they've had at wide receiver over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, the only offense that I think that even halfway compares to what Clemson has is Oklahoma. They're the only ones that kind of match up, but their wide receivers are nowhere near as deep as Clemson's was. So I think the biggest thing that Ohio State really just needs to keep on working on over the next month on the defensive side of the ball is really, ironically, it's Damon Webb, the safety, who is the former cornerback. Just keep on working with him, work with the linebackers. Because I think if Clemson's going to kill them, it's really going to be across the middle, kind of in that 10 to 15-yard range, where it's usually Damon Webb lined up one-on-one with somebody in the slot. And there's just been too many times this year where you could see the wide receiver get that step on Damon Webb and get that, 15, 20-yard gain across the middle. I think on the outside, I think Lattimore and Conley are kind of built to do their job out there. I don't think there's any way they're going to shut down the Clemson guys. They are just too talented. But I think they'll be able to limit their ability to make big plays on the outside. It's really across the middle that I'm kind of concerned with how the Buckeye defense will be able to stop Clemson. The defensive tackles have really came together from the beginning of the year until now. So, I think they have the ability to shut down the Clemson run game. It's just a matter of if we can solidify that middle part of the field for the Buckeye defense and, kind of make them throw the ball downfield and see if Lattimore, Conley, and Malik Hooker can go up and make a play.
Of course, what ended the game last time, as you recall, Brandon, after the Buckeyes got a big interception off Taj Boyd, was Braxton Miller turned around 2 plays later and threw one right to the linebacker. He didn't see him there, and the game was over. Stephon Anthony, yes, for the Clemson Tigers. Braxton Miller to J.T. Barrett. There's a lot of great comparisons we can make from that Ohio State offense 3 years ago to this one. This Clemson unit lost 8 or 9 starters from just a tremendous defense last year, but they've gotten to a point where Alabama is, Ohio State is, Florida State to a certain extent, LSU, where just the mill just keeps running and you just bring in the next guy, because they marched out so many guys at the combine on the defensive side of the ball last year. But they did have some hiccups. Pitt hit them up pretty well with 43 points, a Pitt offense that's pretty pedestrian. And they did give up big plays to Gerard Evans and company against Virginia Tech. So it's a very talented defense, but they have the 1 year of experience. But other than that, not really proven on that side of the ball like they were last year.
They definitely aren't as dominant as they were last year, but I still think the defensive line for Clemson's one of the top ones in the nation. And that's where, the Buckeyes really need to establish some type of dominance on the line front. The offensive line plays good at times. Big person there is Isaiah Prince, who has struggled pretty bad at times. He's looked really good at times. He's young. But, there is, games against Penn State, against Michigan, where Isaiah Prince was just getting manhandled. So I think the offensive line really needs to come together and kind of establish a legitimate running game for the Buckeyes, where they've kind of struggled the last couple of weeks. They've got a bunch of rushing yards because Kurt Samuel's able to make plays. J.T. Barrett is able to scramble. But you look at Mike Weber, he really hasn't done too much these last couple of weeks because, lining up and just pounding the ball at a defense, the offensive line's kind of struggled. So I think against Clemson always comes out in the first half and kind of dominates the run game. If you look in the first half, Clemson only gives up 2.6 yards per carry. I think the Buckeyes need to come out and try to establish the run and keep pushing, because in the second half, Clemson gives up 4.2 yards per carry. So there's a pretty significant difference from first half to second half. So I think they've got a dominant defensive line. I'm just not sure if the depth is there as much as there has been in years past. If you remember that in the Orange Bowl, it seemed like Clemson was just rotating defensive linemen through there like crazy. And this year, I don't think they have that depth. They maybe have better starters this year, but I don't think they have the backups, that they have had in years past. So I think Ohio State needs to establish that run game, tire out that defensive line, and, just kind of punish them into the second half, sort of like what they did against Alabama when they went on that national championship run, where, the first half was kind of Bama jumped out, the Buckeyes just kept on running the ball. And then by the time I got to the second half, Zeke was able to just kind of run through them because they kind of wore down the defensive line. So I think establishing the running game against that great Clemson defensive line is what the Buckeyes have to do to try to keep the offense going.
Yeah, that's exactly my memory of the Clemson-Oklahoma game. It was 10-9 at half. The teams looked fairly comparable. And then in the second half, we know how Baker Mayfield makes his mark, running around, creating plays, extending plays, and the Clemson defensive front would have none of that. They were just too fast. They were all over the place. They boxed him in. They harassed him, much like the Buckeyes did a couple months ago. And on the flip side, Samaje Perine used to having his way, and the Clemson defensive line would have none of it as well. So they really looked impressive against the Oklahoma Sooners last year, but not quite the depth, as you mentioned, along the defensive front. We've got several weeks to break this one down. This is the Ohio State edition, Mark Rogers TV, and we only get this thing done because Brandon Zimmerman joins us from the Buckeye Battle Cry each and every Wednesday night. So, Brandon, we always appreciate the time, and we'll have plenty opportunities to size this one up, and hopefully no injuries, no suspensions, none of that mess to talk about the next few weeks. We can just talk about the football matchup.
Definitely.